Welcome everybody to what I counted to be about our 94th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. It's very good to have Michael Lechner to give the talk today. I've got quite a few things I want to mention at the start in terms of kind of administrative matters. So much so that I even prepared a short PowerPoint for the purpose. So I'm now going to try and find that before I hand over to Michael for his talk. I have to now navigate. Here we go. So we have. I guess I will just try and maximize that just for I'm not too, so it's big enough on your screens. As you'll know, this is our first post-Easter online seminar, Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. Michael is presenting on the effect of sport and online dating, evidence from causal machine learning. Next week, we have the Gijón Sport Economics Conference. The following week is the Rotterdam Conference. And then there's no talk the 20th of May. I'm out of the UK at that point and not with a reliable internet connection. Following that, and again, I'll mention these in a bit more detail in a moment. There's the Western Football and Finance Conference that Bernd Frick and I are organising. There's a public holiday, the 3rd, and the next actual seminar that we will have will be on June the 10th. So we've got another break throughout the entirety of May into June, but we'll have Mario Lechner talking on Can Barely Winning Lead to Losing, and then we'll have Jacob Bundrick from the University of Central Arkansas, our mixed strategy and the money down. Everywhere where you see a TBC, there is not yet a talk there. So if you are interested in presenting, you know somebody who would like to present in the Roses seminar series over the summer, feel free to get in touch with me. I'll be delighted to hear from you. Got presentations from Ruud Koning in July, Michael Batafi, my PhD student, Hannah Altman from Australia, Queensland University of Technology. Then into August, Cornel Nessela from Norway and Alex Cardassi from the University of West Virginia. But as I said, plenty of space in the schedule if you do want to present or know others who are keen to present, or perhaps you have PhD students who would like some experience presenting as well. Next week, we will be, a number of us will be in Gijón. It's a hybrid conference, so you will be able to join in as well should you wish to and not be able to travel. You see my background is the same as this picture here. This is the venue for the conference in Gijón. A number of these characters on the right-hand side will be there. The following week is the ECASE Workshop, the Erasmus Centre for Applied Sports Economics in Rotterdam at the Excelsior Stadium, which you can see a picture of on the right-hand side. 5 fantastic looking talks, and it appears you have to have an S in your either your first name or your surname to be presenting, but all 5 will be fantastic talks, no doubt. However, it's almost certainly not going to be a conference that can be accessed online, so you have to be there in person. So do make your travel arrangements if you can for that, because it looks like a fantastic lineup. I then want to advertise that later in May, we've got the 8th Western Football and Finance Conference. It will be online via Teams in the same format that we have here. And you'll have seen a notification in the week about the Teams room for one of the parts of the conference. But you can join us in person if you want to in Reading. We've got rooms booked and we'll have an informal gathering in Reading if you want to have that in-person experience as well as or in place of the virtual one, because we've had lots of virtual experiences over the last 2 years. If you want to join the number of us that will be in person, do let me know. Again, as mentioned, it's been organised between myself and Bernd Frick, and Bernd, so hence Paderborn University is represented. But we will have a small in-person gathering for that conference. The schedule has now been published online. I'll put a link into the chat for the schedule for the conference, and you can look that up. I'm also organising the 9th Math Sport International Conference. A number of folk here I know have attended this conference in the past in its various places that it's been, including Groningen when Ruud organised it many years ago. And it's taken place in Salford a few times as well. And the abstract deadline is tomorrow. So if you do want to attend, the conference fee will be much lower than it normally is. Historically, it's been quite a high conference fee, but I'm keen, given problems with research budgets that many of us have in light of COVID, there will be a low conference fee, and it will be an in-person event, 11th to 13th of July, at the same time as the UEFA Women's European Championships here in England. So if you're interested in that, again, let me know. I'll put the link into the submission website and also the website for the conference into the chat. But I don't want to hold up Michael any longer than I already have. So Michael, please do take away your talk. The floor is yours.
Thanks, James. Thanks very much for the invitation. And before I start, I like really to thank you for organizing that seminar. I think it's a great service to our community. Thanks again. Thank you very much. All right, so let me share the screen. And I hope you don't hear too much background noise, because for some reason, suddenly some guys decided to do some repairs on the street just opposite here. But that should be done soon. All right, so title of the talk is The Effects of Sports on Online Dating. And it's joint work with Daniel Boller, who was a former postdoc at our institute and is now with the Asian Development Bank, and Gabriel Ocasa, who was one of my PhD students, and he's now a postdoc in Lausanne. Okay, what is this all about, this paper? Generally, I think that there is a big literature on the effect of individual sports. I mean, this is maybe, in that sense, that paper may be different to many others here. We're really talking about not competitive sports, but individual sports. But big literature, we're pretty sure know there are positive effects on health. We have several papers, positive effects on education, positive effects on labor market outcomes, and many other outcome variables as well. But we have very limited evidence, if at all, on the effect of your own sports activity on dating and on success in the dating market, if you want to put it more in econ language, in particular, not on online dating. And this is what we're going to look at the paper here, in that paper here. That's our motivation. And to start up, at least probably that was a dumb question I asked myself, but when I started this, I asked myself, is online dating important at all? And then I realized, I mean, these figures from the US here, you see the online dating line, the blue line to the right. Already in 2017, it was the most important way to meet a potential partner. These are US numbers, but these are 5 years old, and I'm pretty sure after the pandemic, it even got much more the dominating way to meet people. So it's not irrelevant. So what is this paper about? I've given you the 10-minute version of the paper first, and then I talk about all the details. So research questions we try to answer here is, the first one is the key one, really the main one. Does doing sports lead to a larger set of potential partners? The answer we're going to give you is yes. It may increase the number of potential partners actually quite substantially. And if so, for whom? Then the message is only for men, and in particular for rich men. So that's the simple finding of the paper. What do we think is nice in this paper? Actually, again, that's probably was my mistake. When I started that project, I thought online dating is something for the younger ones. Then I realized that the average age on this on the kind of very large typical platform we looked at was 40. So you have actually everybody there. All the age distribution is all over the place. And it may turn out at the end of the day as being another additional motivation for sports, and there are many people in the world who look for motivations for sports because of all these positive effects of sports, and that may be another one that may be useful to communicate to people and make them more sporty. Another cool thing is, I mean, when you're looking for effects of something on something else, there's always the big discussion about identification. Are we really estimating effect or just looking at the correlation? And then you need these famous identifying assumptions for the causal analysis. And here what we're going to impose is an unconfoundedness assumption. So in other words, we observe all the nasty variables that influence treatment's outcome, so that creates a selection bias. Usually you have to make a big argument that actually why you have these variables, and it's plausible that you have almost all of them. Here from the technical outlay of the platform, we have exactly the same data essentially as the people on the platform. So we know that we have the same information set. In that sense, the unconfoundedness assumption is essentially holding by definition, which is super cool if you do causal analysis, of course. So it's then almost as good as an experiment. And the other thing is, the nice thing is that the data is large. We have a couple of 100,000, or not a couple of 100,000, but in the 6-digit sample sizes. That is cool for a couple of reasons. First one, obviously, you're going to get a more precise estimate out of this. Second, you will be able to find heterogeneities if there are heterogeneities, which is kind of hopeless if you have small samples. And third of all, we can really use robust estimation methods. We do not have to impose linear models or parametric models at all, which makes obviously the credibility of the estimation exercise much higher. Finally, but that may or may not be a matter of taste, I think it's also cool that we use one of these estimators that have recently been proposed in the literature, and which I think going to kind of be, or these new type of estimators will be the estimators to use in econometrics in the future for sure. So coming out of this new causal machine learning literature, in particular, we're using a modified causal forest. Yeah, and I'm going to say a few words about this guy and the whole literature later on also. Which then brings you obviously to the question, why do you want a machine learning here? In particular, the causal machine learning version. And that has a couple of reasons for this. I guess the first reason is actually related to the objects we are interested in here. I mean, we are interested at the effect of sports on available partners on the average level. So what's the mean impact? But we are also interested at disaggregated levels, and there you could look at, sorry. Excuse me. So we could look at various levels, and one is kind of a group level, say, is there a differential impact for men, women, or rich and poor people? But we could even go to very disaggregated impact and even search for heterogeneities if you want to do that. And that's also cool, and that is something that you can do under certain conditions, of course, with these new causal machine learning estimators, which you couldn't do systematically with the old type of estimators. We have tons of covariates here, and these machine learning type estimators are better able to deal with these. And of course, as I mentioned before, we do not need to impose any parametric assumptions. So we do not need to impose a wrong model and then hope that it's not so wrong that it really seriously bias our conclusions. All right. So that's kind of what we're doing and how we're doing it and what we find. So what's the literature? There's a huge literature on dating, so I'm not really in any sense going through that literature. You find some of the papers in our paper if you're interested in that. I'm just mentioning two papers here because they relate to online dating. And that's the Rosenfeld-Thomas-Hausen paper, 2019, and an older one from, I'm not really able to pronounce these names correctly, so I don't do it, from 2013, where you already see that there's a substantial market, essentially, or essential share of marriages come from some sort of online dating. There are also a couple of papers that discuss, or actually many papers that discuss individual traits that improve chances on online dating platforms. Again, I'm not going into this in any detail here. The point is there's essentially no evidence on sports, on how sports increases or changes the chances, if at all, on such online dating platforms. And that's what we're going to look here, of course. So looking from a different angle, another chunk of the literature that's relevant here is the sports literature. Obviously, the individual or more like physical activity literature, if you want. And yeah, you see the list of papers. There are many more that kind of discuss the impact on physical health. There are many papers who discuss the impact on mental health. And already also the other papers on other outcomes, like you have the list, you see the list here: poverty and crime, labor market performance, educational performance. And the list of papers I have is by far not complete. There's really more stuff out there, but I don't want to go through all this. You see we find a couple of more in our paper, and some of them are surveys which then have links to more and more papers. So it's really big literature now these days. When you look at the intersection of the online dating literature with the sport literature, that intersection, as I mentioned before, is pretty empty. The only papers we could find were two old papers from 2008, the Schulte, Hofstadter, Eis and Johnson paper and the Farfing paper. The trouble with these papers is, I mean, in those days, data access obviously was much more difficult. Methods were very different, samples were small, and so on and so on and so on. I don't want to go into details really, but I think nowadays you would do things probably fairly different and use the big data we have now nowadays. But at least they started the whole thing already 14 years ago. There is, when you think about literature, as of course the other literature that is relevant, in a sense that we know that if you wealthier, you improve your chances on these dating platforms. If you have higher education, you improve your chances. So sports does increase earnings, at least seems to increase also education. So you might expect that there are indirect effects via these variables. And in this paper, what we try to do is go the direct way and see whether we find direct evidence with current methods, with a plausible identification strategy, and large data. By the way, I think I didn't say that. If you have any comments, any remarks, I don't mind to being interrupted any time. Really, I'm used to this kind of funny econ seminars where you usually have the first criticism before you state your title. So feel free to jump in anytime. Other literature more on the method side. The causal machine learning literature under unconfoundedness. This is what the title here is supposed to mean. And we saw actually that literature has seen tremendous explosions of papers actually in the last, I don't know, 5 to 7 years maybe. Now things cool down a little bit, but and the reason why it's, I think, so exploding is, first of all, many people in many fields realize that they're using essentially similar methods. So you kind of have developments in different fields that spill over into the other field and is taken up by the other field. And the methods turned out to be very powerful. And not only really powerful in the sense that you can predict things, which is what we know from machine learning, and which machine learning does every time continuously in our smartphones and our computers, kind of real time, all the time, but also that we can actually use machine learning in a specific form to answer the questions economists usually have. And the questions economists usually have are causal questions. We want to understand the effect of something on something else. and draw our conclusions from this. And this is really the causal machine learning literature. And what we're going to use here is a special version of a causal forest that is particularly suited for these type of estimations, which we need in this paper and similar papers, so modified causal forest. I'm giving you more details later on, just saying that the kind of key papers on this are really the Vega, essentially the Vega FE paper in JASA 4 years ago. And a follow-up paper, which goes a little bit different route, but kind of exploits, works with the same ideas as the Tipshirani Vega paper for that particular version of the causal forests. And then from there on, some changes have been made. If you're interested more in that stuff, there's actually, sorry, that's the marketing part here. There's a paper of us that appeared in the Econometrics Journal. Although, since the literature is developing so fast and the publication process in econ is more like on the slow side, the estimator used in this paper is not yet in the survey, but you'll see many other estimation approaches down there. All right, so what are we doing? On general level, we take data from Germany. So we have a large, we got data from a large platform in Germany, and the data is pretty informative, is as informative, or we have as much data essentially as is used by the users of the platform. We go the selection on observable setting with the kind of, I think, very powerful argument that we know as much as everybody else. And so there cannot be any unobserved confounding anymore. And then we take this modified causal forest to estimate mean effects and see whether we find that, see whether there are, and on another level, even if we find heterogeneities. So that's the setup. And now I'm going into details. And as I said, whenever you have any question, just jump in. So how does it all work on this platform? Maybe you're familiar with that stuff. I wasn't. So it's useful to remind those of us who are not familiar with that how it works. So you register. When you register, at least on this platform, this is how it works on that platform we're using, right? And I'm not allowed to tell you the name, I think. But if you read the paper, you would figure out the name. When you register, you put information into your profile. You define your profile, you answer questions and thing. And you define a query for a partner. You state your preferred sex, age, location, and then the platform essentially takes all this information together and computes a matching score. And the matching score takes your information and takes the information of all the other participants in that platform. And then tries to figure out for whom it's most likely that you want to meet up. And then you get a list of partners based on this ordered according to this matching score. So the guy with the highest matching score starts on top. I need to say something, I think I didn't mention that. In that paper, we focus entirely on heterosexual couples. Reason is simply sample sizes. There are some homosexual couples there, but the sample sizes are pretty small. So we stick to one thing. That doesn't mean the other thing is uninteresting. It's just that essentially determined by sample size we have. Okay, so you get this matching score. How do you find a partner then? You click on these names and then you get a profile of the others. And then you see the information on the profile, which is essentially what these people put into the platform, same as you put into the platform. And at that moment, you can make a decision, right? You see that information of the potential partner, and then you can send messages in form of an icon. You can exchange these kind of smileys and stuff. You can put a like there. You can put some text there, and you can initiate a friendship, which means that you show your you show your photo. And that's an important thing. When you initially visit a profile, you do not see a photo. You see a very blurred photo where you wouldn't be able to realize, to kind of figure out much, really. It would be very difficult. And I guess you can even play a game with the other, and yeah, you can of course prevent contact from people you don't know want to have. So this is how it works, and this is essentially the information we're going to use in the paper. So what do we have information-wise? Lots of socio-demographic information, search criteria for potential partners. There is a personality questionnaire where you asked about lots of things, and that's then ends up in variables and ends up in indices. And there's a photo which we unfortunately do not have. For the way we do it, it doesn't matter. But if we would have the photo, we would have also been able to look at different things on top of what we do in that paper, but we didn't get it, unfortunately. So it's fully blurred. At the moment we're looking at, it's fully blurred. So the user doesn't know really how the other person looks like. And of course, and that's the key thing for this paper, we also have the sports information, and we have their own activities and preferences. For a partner, we really focus on your own activities, and this has an intensity level and a discipline level, and that should be now. Sorry, I'm giving you more details on the sports activity in a couple of slides. So how does our data look like before we go into the content of all this? First of all, we're not using all the users of the platform, but we got a sample of new users who registered in 2016. So the database is a little bit old, 6 years now, and the first quarter. So from January to end of April, and these were around 18,000 users, and we could use 16,000 because the others had some technical problem. For each of those, we have around 600 and something variables containing all the information I was talking about before. And this gives us what we call an interaction sample, where we have about more than 1 million interactions between the users. We're not using all of them, as you're going to see in a minute. And the interactions essentially tell us what these people did and when they did it and who did it. So we really know everything, which is cool. For an econometrician, it's cool. For any empirical guy, it's cool. It's more like that you know so much that you have to kind of struggle with the data to kind of bring it to dimensions that you can work on easily. So important is each interaction begins with a visit, right? You're looking at these scores, and then you click, and then you look at the profile. And we call a person who did that the sender. The sender is somebody who looks at the profile and now either does something or does not anything. The recipient is the guy who was visited by these people, and you do not know who visited, whether somebody has visited you or not. So that's the starting point. The outcome, and that's now important, right? The outcome is whether a visit on the profile page is followed by action by the sender. So the idea is, if I look at your profile page and I found that interesting and I say hello or something, shall we exchange information? This is our outcome, whether somebody just leaves and looks at the next profile or leaves some sort of message, interaction, whatever. Right? And at that moment, we also stop, right? When we look at this type of data, right, the first interaction, then we find about 180,000 such unique interactions. And this is our data set we're going to analyze from that moment, right? And these are all different individuals, the pairs, different pairs. And yeah, each user gets about 10 visits from other users in this inflow cohort. Gender, there is not an issue here, but there is, I guess, what you expect gender-wise. It's kind of on the platform, it's about 50-50, almost. A little bit more men than women, but the difference is small. The funny thing is, when you look at the recipients on the samples here, there are more, the female sample, the female recipients is larger. In other words, men visit more women than the reverse. So the men are more active on this platform. I think that is not a terrible surprise. And therefore, the two samples are asymmetric in sample size. So a few words about our sports variable we have here. That comes from the initial questionnaire when you enter the platform, and that's supposed not to change during the life of at least in these 4 months here. We actually have very detailed information which we do not use in this paper. Maybe in a follow-up paper we might use even more information there. There are the types of sports and there's the intensity of sport. And we focus entirely on the intensity of sport. And in intensity, we have 5 categories from never, rarely, monthly, weekly, daily. And we kick out the daily category because it's too small. Alternative, we could have merged it with the weekly category, but that wouldn't have changed anything. And yeah, the one thing which we might look at some further point, or somebody of you looks at this in somewhere in the future, is actually that it makes a difference that whether you do team sports or individual sports, because there are papers out there who suggest that might be the case. And you might interact this with these categories, given the sample sizes, that should still actually work fairly easily. But next time, better time. Okay, right now we have just the intensities, and already for the intensities you get interesting results. When you look at the descriptive stats of these intensities, so when you look at men, about half of the men and also half of the there's a pointer, yes. About a bit more than half of the men and a bit less, or almost half of the women do sports on a weekly basis. About a very small proportion does never sports, but there's some variation. The question is, the first question we try to figure out here, is this reasonable? The overall numbers. I mean, given that we have these online platforms, not a random sample from the population. So we compared it with some information from the SEP. Some years ago, I did with Tim initiate the so-called innovation, or a special innovations sample in the German socioeconomic panel that was concerned with individual sports activity. And we had the chance to place lots of questions there. And actually, there's also a question that is kind of relative one-to-one to this one. And from this question, you see in the general population, the sports activity is lower. In particularly, the group that self-declares not doing any sports is substantially larger. So how can that be? There are kind of, I guess, two explanations. First of all, our sample is not the population, right? Our sample is somewhat younger, and our sample is better educated. I guess that's the general feature coming from using an online platform for dating. And the other thing is there's another important difference, that our sample consists of people looking for a partner, and that may also influence how much sport you do. it might even mean that you have no partner at that moment and maybe even more time for sports. Who knows? But the other obvious explanation is that people might lie. That may be true if they think they have better chances, and they probably wouldn't lie too much because at some point the opposite party would figure that out, and starting a relationship with a big lie is probably not the most, yeah, I don't know, but probably not the best strategy. Having in mind that this is not Tinder, right? We're talking about a platform that is supposed to lead to stable relationships, not just meet somebody for a very short time. But we couldn't exclude that. Obviously, there's no way to verify this. So that remains, I'm not sure it remains a concern, but one probably might want to have this in mind.
Michael, just
yes, please.
Peter is asking if the survey that you've got, does it restrict that you're able to determine responses from just those people that are single versus people who are in relationships from this SOEP-IS survey?
Actually, we didn't do that. This is we would be able to do that. Yeah, I'm not sure how many people we are left with because the IS sample is pretty smallish. But that's a good point. Actually, we might do that and see how this changes. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Thanks. So how does the outcome variable vary with the sport frequency? Here you see the split with respect to gender, males and females, and so these are the probabilities that you get a message, and this is for the lowest sports category, this is for the highest sports category. One observation is that if a man is approached by a female, the probability that the man is going to respond is much higher. I should say it differently. If a man visits a woman, he is much more likely to leave a message there than if a woman visits a man. And therefore, you have these different probabilities here. What you see kind of clearly already in the descriptive stats, that the probability of contact increases for the man. So a woman is more likely to leave a message with a sporty man, while the men don't care. But having said this, of course, these subsamples also differ with respect to many other socio-demographics that are related to sport, because we know that people with higher education are more likely to doing sports and all these type of things, right? The literature is full of correlations of people doing sports and not doing sports. So it could be just an effect of a selective subsample here. Could be. So this is what we want to get rid. But this is the first kind of evidence, actually, that there might be something going on for men, which may or may not disappear once we control for all these other variables. And for women, it looks like actually, yeah, a bit noisy, but nothing else at this stage. That's the first impression, not based on any kind of deep scientific econometric estimation. All right, just let me summarize. So the sample are these 18,000 newly registered users leading to 170,000 interactions. And an observation is really when a profile has been visited by somebody in this 4-month window of this inflow cohort. And the outcome is the decision to contact the user. When you visit, you leave a message or you go. And if you leave a message, we code it as a 1. And if you don't do anything, you're a 0. We're going to call this treated and non-treated here. Sorry, not treated, non-treated. That's the outcome. So we're going to look at a binary outcome. The treatment being those 4 categories with the sport frequency. And the confounders are our 600 variables. And we're going to look at a limited number of heterogeneities simply for the reason if you check for 100 heterogeneities, and even if there's nothing, you're going to find 5 for sure. by just a simple thing that you're going to find false positive. So we look systematically only at age, income, and education. So that's the plan. That's the plan, and that's the data. So before I show you the results, let me talk a little bit about identification and estimation. So in other words, at the econometrics underlying all this stuff. I'm trying to avoid lots of technicalities here. You can even forget about the formulas if you follow what I'm trying to be to make an intuitive explanation. All right. So the important thing is we're interested in average effects of these different sports categories at different aggregation levels. Right? The first type of effect we would like to estimate is what we call the individualized average treatment effect. So the individualized average treatment effect is an effect that really varies at the lowest, at the finest level possible here. So these x's here, you would think these are all these 600 something cohorts floating around. So that's almost an individual effect, but of course you can never estimate an individual effect. But it's kind of the interpretation is an average at individuals that are similar to the particular individual you look at. So these are the individualized average treatment effects, very low level of heterogeneity, a very fine level of heterogeneity. Then at the group level, like gender, education, income, the group average treatment effects. So again, an average between the two potential outcomes for the different sport activities, but then at a higher level. So in other words, these are nothing else than aggregated versions of these individualized average treatment effects, aggregated to be the aggregate, say, for all men, for all women, at this type of level. So that's a much higher aggregation level. And then the kind of estimate, the kind of coefficients estimates or estimated all the time in the last 50 years, the average, well, no, maybe 50, maybe 30 years, the average treatment of the average treatment effect. So really the mean effect of being more or less sporty in these different categories on average for the population we're going to look at. And again, that's again an aggregate of these individualized average treatment effects or an aggregate of these group average treatment effects, whatever you want. And we want to get an estimator that's able to estimate all these type of things to understand heterogeneities and to see how it's at the aggregate level. On a kind of general note here, in other settings, these effects also play big roles, right? This individualized average treatment effect, for example, is a very important quantity when you have treatments where at the end of the day, you want to come up with rules whom to allocate to different treatments. That's not the case here, of course, but say if you estimate effects for a labor market program and kind of stuff, that's the most important parameter essentially, because this would allow you to give the program that's most effective for the individual to that particular individual. So these effects are interesting for many reasons in many different settings. So that's what we're going to go for. Identification I already mentioned. We going selection on observables. Essentially, it means that we observe all variables that are jointly related to these potential outcomes and the treatment. In other words, everything that's confounding, right? Once we control for everything that's confounding, there cannot be any confounding left anymore. And given the values of these confounders, we can analyze the data as if coming from an experiment. And this gives us then the causal interpretation. Technically, with respect to these effects, this assumption is strong enough to identify these individualized average treatment effects. And once you identify these things, these effects, since all the others can be written as aggregates with respect to observable variables of these guys, everything is identified and we are happy on the identification level. That's of course just technicalities, right? The question always in the empirical application is it enough to control for these variables? So is this assumption we make here really plausible in a particular setting? And the key question you have to answer, you have to ask yourself is, are there other variables that could influence the selection into sports here, so doing more or less sports, and also influence partner choice on this online platform. And that's the cool thing here, since we know exactly the same thing that the members of the platform, since they do not know more, there cannot be any other confounder. The only concern, oops, that was too quick. The only concern that might remain, what we do not have the photo, and they see the blurred photo. But on that photo, you wouldn't realize anything. Maybe you can guess the hair color, something like this. Maybe you can guess a rough shape of the face, approximately. That type of thing. So we're not really worried about this at all. So that's cool. I don't think I go too much into the econometrics. Yeah, let me just kind of summarize the next couple of slides here in a few words. There have been huge developments in these type of methods that are able to uncover the heterogeneities and give us also average treatment effects with much more confidence than where we could put in much more confidence than before, because we can get rid of very many assumptions here. And there are kind of two general paradigms, I would say, for methods that I would call comprehensive methods. And I would call a method comprehensive if I can use the same method for estimating all these different parameters. Right? Essentially, the way to think about you're estimating something like 200,000 parameters here, more or less. And it would be pretty bad if you would, or pretty difficult if you would need a different methods for these IRTEs and the gates and the aids. Then you have always to check the tuning parameters, see whether nothing stupid happened and all this. And there are kind of seem to be two different approaches now that are comprehensive in that sense. And one is the double machine learning approach that started with a famous paper by Chandra Sukhov and his co-authors. And I think that's on the next slide, somewhere here. Yeah. And has been now developed quite substantially. It's still not super comprehensive, that is, you're still going to need different methods. There's still a couple of open issues there, but if you're interested in looking at this further, I'll just can hint you to a paper by Michael Knaus. Again, sorry for all this marketing, a guy who's in my institute and one of my former PhD students, but he's going to Tübingen now. And here's a paper that's now forthcoming in the Econometrics Journal, which kind of explains how you can kind of make all the different methods as similar as possible to get something like a comprehensive method out of double machine learning. And the second way, so the main idea of double machine learning is take standard machine learning estimators and put them into moment conditions and then use these moment conditions. There is an alternative approach, and the alternative approach, or many alternative approaches, but the one I think is most promising, is changing a particular machine learning estimator, which works nicely, such that from being not a stupid, but from being a standard machine learner that is good in prediction and nothing else, to become a causal machine learner that is able to answer causal questions. And this is the causal forest literature. And essentially, the causal forest literature took the random forests. You're probably familiar with random forests. These are these guys who at some point won very many prediction methods before the deep neural networks became so popular. And in these random forests, what you essentially do is you build something that's called trees that kind of splits the data in similar regions. And you do this on random subsamples and do this many, many times. Right. But we don't want to do predictions. So essentially, a random forest becomes a causal forest if you change the rule how these sample splitting is done, essentially. And the causal forests then can be later on optimized in in a modified causal force. The technical beauty of all this is that although these estimators sound complicated, at the end of the day, they're just weighted means of outcome variables, and therefore very easy to use. Yeah, the key paper for this is the JASA paper of VGF, and then I have written stuff on this, and we use exactly this what I've done. I think I'm skipping a little bit these details. I'm more than happy to answer questions. One way to the way to think about the modified causal forest is that you take the good old causal forest of VGF and then you improve it with the splitting rule. You use the fact that all the causal forests are weighted means, and therefore once you have the EIT as a weighted mean, you can also just aggregate the weights, and you can use these weights for inference. So, and this modified causal forest we now use to get our effects. First of all, the first decision we made is that we're going to split our samples, since it seems that men and women behave fairly differently. We from the outset split the samples into a male and female subsample, male and female subsample, and did the analysis for both separately. And here you already see, I think that's probably the key table in the paper, where we look at the average effects. So what do you see here? These are the estimated potential outcomes on the main diagonal, here for men and here for the women. So what's the difference to the descriptive stats I showed you before? Essentially, the difference is that these are now adjusted for differences in the covariance by using that modified causal forest guy. And when this one here would give you the probability of, or the contact probability if you do no sports at all, and this one would be the contact probability if you do sports weekly, which is our most intensive category here. And for men, you see this is increasing. Off diagonal, you see essentially the differences between these elements on the main diagonal. So there's a substantial increase when you go from no sports at all to weekly sports, but even here from rarely in all these categories. It goes monotonically upward. When you look at the women, it goes up and down. It's very hard to spot anything systematic here. The highest level you find for never and weekly, but the differences are small. There is one effect that is kind of significant here at the 5% level, but I would give that due to chance, I would say. It's not monotone, it's kind of these effects going up and down, so it doesn't make too much sense here that this guy. But this is what can be. I mean, this is what the p-value is. You estimate a couple of effects, and then something is significant by chance. Here, everything is as you expect. You have a monotonous increase, and if you look then at significance, actually, the difference between the highest category and those two are significant. The difference between the highest and the next highest is not significant and goes in the direction what you expect, but the effect is not large enough to become significant with these standardized. But everything looks looks very consistent and points in only one direction. All right, so that's oops, something here. Yeah, it's a clear-cut result for the man, and it's, I think, more or less nothing for the women. So if you do more sports, your probability of being contacted by a woman on the platform increases substantially. Then we looked for heterogeneity. We actually looked for 4 variables here. Income, on top of the heterogeneity for sex, of course, because we split the sample anyway. But within now gender, we look for income, education, sport frequency of the sender, and the distance between the two. We didn't find anything for the education and the distance, but what we did find is that the effect is positive for all income levels, but it gets larger for higher income levels. What you see in these plots is the effect for men. And the plot is normalized to the average effect. So this 0 means that that's the deviation from the average effect. So for these men here, the effect is higher than the average. For these men here, the effect is lower than the average, but it's always positive. Right? And for the wealthy guys, being active in sports, it helps you more than for the poor guys. That's essentially the message of this slide. And yeah, when you look at the features of the sender, so the woman, then you see the same thing. It's the higher earnings women where this comes from. But then what we also know that high earnings women are likely to match high earnings men. So that might come from this. A possible interpretation really is that the effect is higher, probably due to the increased interest in that sports variable from the high earning women. Although that's to some sort of speculation behind that.
Michael, just to interrupt you, Juan de Diaz asked control group is in analysis you presented across income.
Sorry, can you say it again? It was kind of.
What is the control group in the analysis on the previous slide?
The control group, it's we always have the 4 different treatment groups, right? Then we estimate effects for everybody. And then we aggregate these effects. And here we aggregate them for the different income levels. And this is what we see here. So the control group is then for the highest income level, if you want, the guys with very low sport activity and also with the highest income, in the highest income group. So it's really, this is a heterogeneity plot. This is the deviation from the effect.
Okay.
Is that clear? Yeah, I'm aware that not everybody may be familiar with these type of things because pretty new stuff. But I don't want to make too much marketing for these type of new methods. But if you think about econ, right? I mean, lots of our stories are about heterogeneity. And if you think about econometrics in the past, we had really totally unsatisfying methods to look at heterogeneity. You had interaction terms and all this kind of ad hoc stuff, right? With this new literature coming up and all these kind of clever guys who prove the properties for these things, we now really have a tool that allows us to systematically analyze heterogeneities. And for so many fields, that is, I think, such a huge potential. That's really super cool. And that's just, that has nothing to do with that paper essentially. But we now really have tools that 5 years ago we did not have. And they work nicely. And they give us information we always looked for, I think. Well, that's my subjective take, I must admit. All right. So this is what we found for the groups. And then we also kind of looked at the IRTs directly with the idea maybe we overlooked something super important. And how can you look at these IRT directly? So you can essentially cluster them, like use any kind of clustering method. Here we use k-means clustering. So we cluster according to the effects. And then we see whether the different clusters have different covariate distributions. And if those guys with very high IRTs look very different from those with very low IRTs, you would consider there seems to be important heterogeneity. So that's the idea of doing this. When we did this here, it seems we didn't, well, it seems, I don't know, but we weren't able to find anything on top of what we already looked for. Interestingly, we saw the income eligibility again, but we didn't see anything clear-cut new stuff coming out of this. So there wasn't much on top. All right, so these are already the results. Is there anything of a concern? I think there is one. There's one important concern here, which I've been hiding so far. We did one little trick, and the one little trick was that our sample is based on individuals who visit somebody, and only if you visit somebody you can become part of the sample. And then the outcome is whether the person you see is interesting enough to leave a message. But you could, of course, argue that already the fact that you visit something, somebody does something that has maybe something to do with sports. So we were trying to address that issue, whether that might be a problem or not. And the reason where it could come from is that if something weird goes on with that matching score, because that gives you the list of people you want to visit. And if you don't see anybody there, if you don't see the person there, you will not be able to visit him or her there. So what we did was a little placebo study. We used our outcome. So we used our treatment, and then we changed the sample. Instead of using actual interactions, we use all possible interactions. And these are, of course, this is a huge amount of data. And from this huge amount of data, we draw random samples of the same size that we have in our real study. And then the outcome variable becomes whether I'm visit the profile or not. And you would be worried if the sports activity actually influences this outcome. And the good news is from the placebo study, it doesn't. And essentially, numbers are much smaller here than, of course, well, but there's nothing significant and nothing big. So in that sense, we survived that placebo exercise and felt now pretty good about this initial selection. Trouble is, if you have to work with 38 million observations, it gets a bit messy, at least given the computers we have and the algorithms we have. So, and it's also not super informative. All right, so that brings me already to the conclusion. So we investigated the effect of sports on contact chances in online dating. Finding is that the sport activities of women seem not to matter much for men. At least they don't react to that at the early stages of contacts. The sport activities of men increase their potential chances of being contacted by women. And when I say sport activities, it's always subjectively reported sport activities. And this increases if men become richer, or if men are richer. And therefore, doing more sports is good for many reasons. It's also good to find a partner for men. All I can say now is thanks very much. And if you're interested in the paper is on the archive. If you're interested in the code, there's the Python code for this machine learner is downloadable on PyPy, and the R code is not on CRAN, but you can get it on request. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Michael. Fascinating paper. We've got lots of time for questions and comments. So if anyone has any questions and comments, please feel free to raise your hands or unmute yourselves and ask away. Stefan.
Thanks, Michael. That was really interesting, and I will say so. Personally, I have personal knowledge about this. So my current partner Silke and I met on online dating. We've been together 9 years, and we've written 2 books together. So I think we're a good advert for the mechanism. I guess my question is though about what your final conclusion: doing sport is good for you. So is it? I mean, that in some sense, the implication is that then when people say they're doing sport, they're truthfully revealing that they're doing sport. So what my counterexample would be when doing online dating in Michigan, pretty much every woman you would see said she liked watching sports. I honestly don't believe that's really true. I think actually what they knew is that Michigan men almost all watch sports religiously. And if you say you don't like watching sports, that's it. You're out of the picture. So couldn't it just be that this is some kind of screening device? If you say, and so I would think it might have something to do with health, for example. So if you say you do sports, that's a signal that you're a healthy man. And I think a lot of women don't really want to have themselves loaded down with unhealthy men, because they're paying to look after, and who needs it? On the other hand, a man who says he doesn't do sports is actually maybe signaling that he does have health issues. He knows he's not going to get as many hits with this, but at least he knows it's somebody who is potentially willing to tolerate serious ill health. I mean, that's so. Can you differentiate that explanation from your argument that doing health is it makes you more attractive to women?
No, I think we can't. I'm not entirely sure I care too much, because it still means that sports increases your chances. Or for you, essentially talking about why, and that your explanation is one possible explanation. That's a signaling device, and as long as people don't lie like crazy, which would not be a very sustainable strategy, I think, that's fine.
Oh,
people
sorry.
do sports for different reasons, right?
Maybe you need to do some empirical testing of this yourself. People lie like crazy on online dating. Trust me, there is very little truth telling going on. Particularly, one thing is age. I mean, you're kidding me? The ages people claim to be, it's just a joke. I mean, so no, I really don't believe online dating has anything very much to do with truth telling.
Okay, so I'm not asking why you used it despite not believing anything you see there.
No, well, because it's a great way. No, it's a great way to meet people, but you get to meet them, and then you find the truth out when you meet them, right? Okay. And you get a very fuzzy signal, but it's a signal, but it's just a very, very fuzzy, noisy signal that you're getting. That's all.
This I can imagine, but I mean the point is, people take the signal somewhat seriously. Otherwise, you wouldn't see an effect, right? They would probably.
No. You're right.
So there's some lying and some information in it, but there should be probably some information, or people are totally naive.
Well, I think saying you do sports, I think it's your conclusion I'm really quibbling with. I don't think you should say that this shows that doing sport makes men more attractive to women. I don't think that's true. I think what's saying you do sport can make men more attractive to women.
Yeah. This was I was trying hinting it by saying the subjective revealing of
great. It's really interesting.
Yes, I fully agree.
Really great work. Nice.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks, Stefan. More questions and comments? Juan de Dios.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I have a question about the methodology. I know it's not the main topic of the presentation. You didn't want to explain the methodology in much detail because it's something very technical, but I'm interested in that. You mentioned that it's a double robust estimation, and you use propensity score, right?
No. No. The double machine learning is based on a double robust estimation idea, put it that way, but not these causal forests.
Okay. So basically, you use the double robust estimation idea, and you estimate both the propensity score.
I don't. The double machine learning is based on this, but we didn't use double machine learning. We use causal force. There is no double robust idea in the causal force.
Okay. So basically, basically you just estimate one model for the response function, and you compare the observed reaction and the counterfactual, the hypothetical reaction, yes. Right? And you compare that for each individual, and then you aggregate everything.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yes. Is that the only thing I wanted to understand? Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Andreas. More questions and comments? Okay, well, not too many questions and comments. I guess I might just try and see if I can sketch out my understanding of your placebo test, Michael. Was the idea there that you essentially had, you looked at all possible connections between people in terms of viewing their profile, and it was a 0 if they didn't view that profile, and it was a 1 if it was, and you were looking at the factors determining whether a profile was viewed rather than an approach was made?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. All potential views, and then whether you actually went to one particular profile, that would be the outcome variable, and the treatment is still the same as before. This was intensity, and there was nothing.
Okay.
And it could be, the problem could have been the mechanics of how the company computes this matching score. And this is what we wanted to rule out.
Okay. Quandidius, your hand's still up. I assume that's just from...
Sorry. Oh, nothing. Thank you.
It's okay. Any more questions and comments? Assuming not, well, it's clear you pitched your talk perfectly, Michael. What was a really very interesting data set, methods as well, and really interesting findings in terms of sportiness and online dating. So thank you very much for that talk. As I shared at the start, we now have another break in terms of talks. While we have a number of conferences, the Gijón conference next week, then the Rotterdam ECASE conference the following week, and then towards the end of May we have the Western Football and Finance Conference, both online and here in Reading. We're next going to be meeting online for Rose's talk on June the 10th, when we have Mario Lechner presenting on Can Barely Win Lead to Losing, Evidence for a Substantial Gender Gap in Psychological Momentum. As we wrap up, just another reminder, it's in the chat, and contact me if you do want information and you're not able to find it online. We have the 9th Math Sport International Conference taking place in Reading in July. The abstract deadline is tomorrow, so if you want to submit an abstract for that conference, please do head online and do that by tomorrow if you are able to. Thank you once again. Thank you, Michael. Thanks everyone for attending, and have a great weekend, and see you all hopefully in person soon, and if not, see you back on Teams in a few weeks' time.
Thanks very much, James.
Cheers,
Thanks, everybody.